Welcome to Quilting Pantographs using the Cutie Frame. Today I'm going to share some of my tips and tricks for getting flawless results using a pantograph from the rear. I start by attaching the fabric clamps to the back bars first. I use reference points in the quilt such as vertical and horizontal seam lines to help me keep my quilt squared up to the frame. The first zone of quilting will need bungees or side leaders to help keep the quilt taut. I will have the bottom of the last row of quilting about 2 to 3 inches below my back bar. Once I'm happy with the placement of the quilt, I will roll and clip the excess fabric at the back of the quilt using the fabric straps. I do not need to use the front straps as my machine has the overhead handles. My pantograph has two colors. The black row is what I will be quilting, and the orange is meant to show where the previous and next rows of quilting should be to keep scale. I chose the spot on the orange row to adjust my laser for proper registration. In this example, I have chosen where two of the curves come together on the pumpkin. I will now start the registration process to ensure that my next row of stitching will maintain my desired scale and placement of stitches. I move my needle so it is directly over where the two curves of the pumpkin come together in my previous row of stitching and add channel locks to keep the machine from moving. This is why it was important to make sure the previous row of stitching was at least 2 to 3 inches below the back bar so I would be able to move the needle to this spot on the front of my quilt. Once I am happy with the placement of my needle and the channel locks are in place, I will move to the rear of the frame to adjust the pantograph and laser. To ensure that the pantograph is in the right spot, I make sure that the paper is parallel with the Cutie frame and will shift the design to be close to where the laser is pointing. I will adjust the laser to match on the paper where the machine needle is sitting on the quilt. In this example, it is where the two swirls on the bottom of the pumpkin meet. I will use wonder clips to keep the paper from sliding once it is where I want it. To be sure that my quilt is loaded parallel to the frame, I will check additional spots across the quilt and ensure that the stitched part matches where my laser points on the paper. For this, I chose the tip of the swirl near the middle of the pantograph and the same spot on the pumpkin further down the pantograph. I, cont- I continue moving the machine down the frame and checking that the reference points match between the paper pantograph and the front of my quilt. You will see here that my laser is about an inch higher than it should be on the last reference point. This would mean that I didn't get my quilt loaded parallel to the frame and I will need to adjust the quilt top to ensure my pantograph appears flawless. I will repeat the same process shown before to load the frame, paying extra attention to ensure that horizontal and vertical seams are parallel to the Cutie frame. Once loaded, I will repeat the same registration process. I will make sure the previously selected reference points match between where my needle is on the front of the quilt and where the laser is on the pantograph. I will move the front of the quilt to have the needle sitting over a reference point. In this instance, I'm looking at the bottom of the star. I then ensure that my laser is sitting in the same spot on the back of the pantograph. I move on to the tip of the swirl, once again making sure that these 2 points match up between where my needle is sitting on the front of the quilt and hovering on the over the pantograph. Finally checking that the last pumpkin is matching where those 2 points come together. As you can see this time around, I have loaded my quilt properly and I will now be able to stitch out my pantograph parallel to the frame. I put my channel locks on to make sure that the quilt doesn't move to do a double check from the front that the needle is sitting over the same point of my stitching as I am seeing on the laser on the back end. Once I have verified this, I make sure all my clips are securely fastened, that there isn't anything that will keep the frame from moving slowly or accidentally sewing over my elastic straps. As I get ready to stitch the pantograph, I tack down my batting to the backing using the sewing machine, and will sometimes use medical tape to help keep my front from getting caught on the border of my quilt. I start the design in the batting so that you aren't able to see a start or stop on the front of the quilt. Once I feel good about the tension of the quilt and that the layers are smooth, I will move to the rear of the frame to begin sewing the pantograph. I use the pantograph as a guide. If I stray from the printed design, I slowly make my way back to the printed design to make sure there aren't any jagged lines and that the design remains similar to what is printed, but I don't worry too much if it isn't exact. I will continue following the design until I have reached the edge of the Cutie frame. I typically like to stop at an easily recognizable spot on the pantograph that will help ensure as I shift it, I will be able to match it back up on my pantograph for continued seamless stitching. I'm going to add some music here and we will check back in once we get to the end of this row of stitching. Once we have reached the end of the quiltable space on the pantograph, it is time to shift our quilt horizontally. To help keep the quilt parallel to the frame, I add channel locks to the machine carriage only. I am currently using the Handy Quilter channel locks and typically like to add 2 just to be sure it doesn't shift. This will stop the machine from moving back to front or front to back. I also set my machine to end with the needle down. I will move to the front of the frame and remove all fabric straps and fabric clips with the exception of the furthest right clip on the back bar. This will help keep the quilt in place as I shift it to the left. I start by removing the back fabric clips. Once those are removed, I will remove my side clamps on each side or bungees if I have them. After the side clamps are removed, I will remove the front clamps. And finally, I will remove 2 of the 3 back clamps, leaving the furthest right back clamp to help guide my quilt as I am shifting to the left. The frame has very little resistance when shifting with the needle down. However, be sure your quilt isn't dragging, which could cause a tear or a break in the needle. You shouldn't have to pull too hard for the quilt to shift. I move the quilt as far to the left as I can. That will still allow me to continue with the design without hitting the frame. This can sometimes take a bit of an adjustment, moving it back and forth to make sure it's in the right spot of where it's going to allow me to have that space and be able to continue with the pantograph. Once the quilt is shifted, I will reclamp the quilt down using the same horizontal and vertical visual markers to ensure the quilt is still parallel to the frame. Because I kept one of the back clamps on, it should make it easier to line up the quilt and ensure that it is staying parallel to the frame. I attach the fabric clamps to the back bar first, and then when I am satisfied with that, I will straighten out the quilt and I will attach the fabric clamps to the bar in front of the quilt. Depending on the width of the quilt, I will use the side clamps or bungees as needed. This is also an instance where you could add side leaders if that helps you get to the edge of your quilt to keep everything nice and tight, but not too tight. Now that my quilt is clamped, it is time to secure the back end by rolling the excess of the back quilt and securing it with the fabric straps. The quilt has been shifted, the excess is tied up, and the quilt is secured with the clamps. I will now move to the rear of the quilt and adjust the pantograph so that the laser is close to where I stopped stitching on the front of the quilt. In this example, I stopped at the point at the top of the pumpkin near the first curve. I shifted the pantograph so that the laser is close to that point, and then I will move the laser to fine-tune the alignment. I also make sure that my pantograph is still parallel to my table to ensure that we will be getting a straight line as we continue stitching. Once I'm satisfied, I continue stitching the pantograph until I have reached the edge of the cutie frame. I typically like to stop at an easily recognizable spot on the pantograph. I will repeat these steps of removing the fabric straps and the fabric clamps and sliding horizontally until I have reached the end of the quilt. In this example, because I was at the end of my row, I shifted the quilt horizontally far enough for my laser to match on the pantograph where I stopped stitching. If you wanted to, you could also shift the quilt just far enough to be able to finish the quilting without the machine hitting the side of the frame and shift the pantograph to match, as we did in the last step. Once it is where I want it, I will reclamp the back and the front. Now that I have reached the edge of the quilt, I will use the Grace clips and bungees to secure the edge of the quilt and provide tension. To help keep the borders of the quilt from flipping up, I use medical tape to help me with my stitching. Continue stitching until all of the quilt top is quilted. If a large portion of the design is on the batting and backing only, I will travel to a point in the pantograph where I will be back on the quilt. Continue these steps until all rows of your quilt. Continue repeating these steps until all rows of your quilt are finished.